The coins slipped through Georgia Redmond's trembling fingers before she could even count them properly, rolling across the rough wooden counter of Hargrove's general store like tiny copper accusations. She already knew the sum was wrong. She already knew she was $3.40 short. She had counted the money 4 times that morning in her small rented room above the livery, sitting on the edge of a cot that groaned under the weight of her worry, and the number had not changed once. $3.40, the difference between eating and starving, the difference between pride and ruin. Mr. Hargrove stood behind the counter with his arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression carrying that particular brand of pity that felt worse than contempt. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and practical men in the town of Redemption, Texas in the spring of 1878 did not extend credit to women who had no husband, no land, and no certain future. Georgia straightened her spine. Her jaw was tight. The flour, the salt pork, the dried beans, and the small tin of coffee she needed to get through the next 2 weeks were stacked on the counter between her and Hargrove like a wall she could not climb. She was 26 years old and she had crossed 500 miles of desert and prairie to start over in this town, and she was not going to weep in a general store in front of a man who smelled of tobacco and boot leather. "I can leave the coffee," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And perhaps the salt pork. If you would give me the flour and the beans today, I can bring you the rest of what I owe by Friday." Hargrove unfolded his arms and opened his mouth, and Georgia felt something cold move through her chest, the kind of cold that comes not from temperature, but from the recognition of a humiliation that is already in motion and cannot be stopped. And then a voice came from behind her. "Put it on my account." The voice was low and unhurried, the way a river is unhurried, carrying enormous weight without announcing it. Georgia turned around slowly, because she was not the kind of woman who startled easily, not anymore. The man standing 3 feet behind her was tall in the way that the land in West Texas was tall, meaning it went on longer than you expected, and it did not apologize for it. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was shadowed with several days of growth, and his eyes were the color of the sky just before a storm, that particular gray-blue that looks peaceful only to people who have never been caught in one. He was wearing a worn canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, and a hat that sat low on his forehead, and he was looking at Hargrove with an expression that was not asking permission. "Mr. Hawkins," Hargrove said, and his entire demeanor shifted the way a compass shifts near metal. "Of course." "I didn't realize you were the lady's order," Clayton Hawkins said, and then he looked at Georgia for the first time, and there was something in his eyes that was not pity and was not charity and was something she did not have a name for yet. All of it. Before she could count her last coins, he had already settled her bill quietly. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but it felt like the whole town had leaned in to listen. Georgia Redmond held those useless coins in her palm and looked at this stranger who had just erased her humiliation as casually as a man wipes dust from his boot, and she felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was gratitude so fierce it frightened her. The second was fury. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. He did not look uncomfortable. He did not look smug. He simply looked like a man who had done an ordinary thing and was prepared to move on from it. "I don't accept charity from strangers." "It's not charity," he said. "It's credit. You can pay me back when you're able." He picked up his own modest order from the end of the counter, a paper-wrapped package that Hargrove must have prepared in advance, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Redmond," she said before she could stop herself. "Georgia Redmond. Clayton Hawkins," he said, and then he walked out the door and the bell above it rang once and he was gone. Georgia stood in the silence of Hargrove's general store for a long moment with her coins still clutched in her hand, her supplies waiting on the counter, and something new and dangerous turning over slowly in her chest like an ember catching a breath of wind. She had come to Redemption, Texas, to escape a past that had tried its best to destroy her. She had not come here to fall in love. She had made that decision very firmly on the long, dusty journey west, sitting in a wagon that smelled of other people's hope, watching the horizon eat the world she had left behind. No more love. No more men who made promises. No more Georgia Redmond believing in anything that could be taken away. She gathered her supplies, walked out into the bright West Texas morning, and told herself the ember meant nothing. She was wrong, of course, but it would take her quite a while to admit it. Georgia Redmond had come to Redemption from Memphis, Tennessee, which is as far from West Texas as a person can get while still remaining on the same continent. Not in miles only, but in spirit, in texture, in the fundamental assumptions people make about how the world works. In Memphis, she had been Georgia Redmond née Carroll, wife of Thomas Redmond, a man who had turned out to be three different people all sharing the same charming face. She had married him at 22, certain she knew the full shape of him, and spent the next 4 years discovering the hidden rooms he kept locked behind his eyes. Thomas Redmond was not violent. She wanted to be clear about that, because sometimes when women left their husbands people assumed the worst, and the worst had not happened to her in that particular way. Thomas Redmond was something more insidious than violent. He was dishonest in layers, the way certain rocks are layered, and each time Georgia thought she had reached the bottom of his deception, she found another stratum beneath it. There was the debt she had not known about, then the other woman she had not known about, then the business partners he had cheated, who came to their door one evening with hard eyes and harder voices. Then the money he had borrowed from her inheritance, which her father had left her, the only thing her father had left her, and which Thomas had invested in a scheme that was never going to succeed because it was never a real scheme at all. Just a story he told her while the money disappeared. She had left him on a Tuesday morning in February of 1878, 3 years after her father's death and 6 months after the last of the inheritance was gone. She had taken what remained of her pride, a carpet bag and $42 she had saved in secret over the course of 2 years, by setting aside small amounts from the household money and hiding them in the lining of a winter coat. It was not enough to start over. It was enough to start moving, which is not the same thing, but in certain circumstances is just as important. She had heard about redemption from a woman on the stage heading west, a wide-shouldered woman named Mrs. Paulette Hobbs who ran a boarding house in San Antonio and spoke about the frontier towns with the authority of someone who had invested considerably in their futures. Redemption was growing, Mrs. Hobbs said. It had a school and a church and a proper doctor since last fall, and the railroad was coming within 2 years, and there was decent work for a woman who was willing to work hard. Seamstress work, laundry, cooking for the bunkhouses. Teaching, if she had education enough. Georgia had education enough. She had been raised by a father who believed firmly that daughters deserved the same schooling as sons, which had been a somewhat radical position in Memphis in the 1860s and 1870s. She could read Latin and cipher in her head and discuss the novels of Charles Dickens with more intelligence than most men she had encountered. And she could also cook and sew, because her mother had been a practical woman who understood that a girl needed all the tools she could carry. She arrived in Redemption on a Wednesday in late March of 1878 with $31 left to her name, 2 dresses, her carpet bag, and the kind of determination that comes from having already survived the worst thing you thought could happen to you. She rented a room from a Mrs. Caldwell who ran the boarding house above the livery, and she put up a notice on the board outside the post office advertising her services as a seamstress and her availability as a reading tutor for children, and she got to work. For 6 weeks, she did well enough. The women of Redemption were practical about clothes and appreciated a quick and skilled hand with a needle. The school had no teacher at present, the previous one having moved on to California in February, and the school board was considering Georgia for the position beginning in September. She had enough money coming in to pay her rent and buy her meals and even save a little. She began to breathe somewhat more normally. Then the Henderson girl's wedding dress happened. It was a beautiful piece of work, 14 yards of ivory silk that had come all the way from San Antonio, and Georgia had spent 3 weeks on it, doing the kind of fine embroidery at the collar and cuffs that required her to work by good daylight and stop when the light failed, because the stitches were so small that lamplight was not sufficient. She had done everything right. She had done everything perfectly. And then Mr. Henderson, who was paying for the dress, had a difference of opinion with his future son-in-law over the disposition of some grazing land, and the wedding was called off on a Thursday evening, and on Friday morning Mr. Henderson sent word that he would not be paying for the dress. Georgia had gone to speak with him personally. She had explained, calmly and with considerable restraint, that the dress was made and the work was done, and the fabric was cut, and the contract, such as it had been, was a binding one. Mr. Henderson had looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided that a woman arguing about money is tiresome and somewhat unseemly, and told her that she could keep the dress as payment. An unworn wedding dress in a frontier town was not currency. It was not close to currency. It was 3 weeks of skilled labor in exchange for nothing Georgia could use. So when she walked into Hargrove's general store that May morning with exactly $6.20 to her name, and a list of supplies she needed to survive the next 2 weeks while she waited for other orders to come in, and discovered the total was $9.60, the math was simply and completely impossible. And now Clayton Hawkins had stepped into the gap that the math created, quietly and without ceremony, and Georgia did not know what to do with that. She saw him again the following morning. She was returning from the schoolhouse where she had been speaking with Mr. Adler, the head of the school board, about the teaching position. The conversation had gone reasonably well. Mr. Adler was a serious man who believed in education and had asked Georgia several thoughtful questions about her methods and her experience, and she had answered them honestly and with enough confidence that she felt cautiously optimistic. The position was nearly hers. September was not so far away. She was walking back along Main Street, past the barber shop and the telegraph office and the saloon that was quiet at this hour of the morning, and she nearly walked directly into Clayton Hawkins, who was coming out of the telegraph office with a folded paper in his hand and his attention fixed on it. He looked up at the last second and stepped to the side, and she did the same, and they ended up facing each other on the boardwalk with perhaps 18 inches between them, which was close enough that she could see a faint scar along the line of his jaw and the fact that he had shaved since yesterday. "Miss Redmond," he said, and the name in his mouth sounded different than it did in her own head, somehow more settled, as if he had already decided to remember it. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. She had been thinking about what to say to him since the general store, running through various approaches and discarding them, and now that the moment was here she found that all the prepared phrases had scattered. "I owe you an apology," she said instead, and that was not what she had planned to say at all. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and waited. "I was rude to you yesterday," she said. "You did me a kindness and I responded poorly. I had no call to be sharp with you and I'm sorry for it." "You had every call," he said. "I stepped into your business without being invited. Pride's a reasonable response to that." "Pride and good manners aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "My mother would agree with me on this." Something shifted very slightly in his expression, so brief she might have imagined it, a small interior movement like light changing behind glass. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was," Georgia said. "She died when I was 15. She did not know why she told him that. She had not told many people in Redemption about her mother. It was the kind of information that came out unexpectedly, like water through a crack, and it usually meant something she was not prepared to examine. He held her gaze for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the kind of sorry that was not a formality that had weight to it. "I'll have your money back to you by the end of the month," she said, returning to practical ground because practical ground was safer. "I have orders coming in and the school board is considering me for the teaching position in September. I expect to be entirely solvent by June." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'll take the minimum," she said firmly. "I don't carry debt easily." "Neither do I," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that suggested he was not speaking entirely about money. He glanced down at the telegram in his hand for a moment, and a line appeared between his brows, quick and dark, like the shadow of a passing bird. "Good morning, Miss Redmond." He touched his hat brim and moved past her on the boardwalk. Georgia watched him go for a moment she could not account for. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction and had a very stern internal conversation with herself about the nature of gratitude and how it should not be confused with anything else. She asked Mrs. Caldwell about him that evening over supper, because Mrs. Caldwell knew everyone in Redemption and spoke about them with great thoroughness. Georgia asked the question carefully, framing it as the natural curiosity of a newcomer about the community she had joined, which was at least partially true. Mrs. Caldwell, who was a small woman with sharp eyes and a great deal of energy that she directed mostly toward feeding people and knowing their business, set down her fork and considered the question with visible pleasure. "Clayton Hawkins had come to Redemption 4 years ago," she said. "He had a cattle ranch about 12 miles east of town, a good-sized operation he had built up from nothing. Before that, nobody was completely certain, which was not unusual for men who came west. There were rumors, as there always were. Some people said he had been a lawman up in Kansas. Some people said he had served in the war, though he would have been very young. Some people said there had been a woman in his past, and that the ending of that story was why he had come so far south. Mrs. Caldwell did not vouch for any of these rumors, but she offered them in the spirit of completeness. What she did vouch for was his character in Redemption. He was fair with his cowhands, paying honest wages and running a clean operation. He had helped finance the rebuilding of the church after it burned down in 1876 without making a public event of it. He bought his supplies at Hargrove's and drank moderately at the saloon on Saturday evenings and attended church on Sunday mornings, not with the ostentatious regularity of a man performing virtue, but with the quiet consistency of a man who meant it. He was well liked without being social, respected without being celebrated, and he had not, to Mrs. Caldwell's considerable knowledge, shown particular interest in any of the women of Redemption in the 4 years he had been there. Georgia absorbed this information and returned to her room and told herself it was simply background knowledge about the community she had joined. She slept badly and dreamed about storm-colored eyes. The next time she saw him was at the Sunday service, where she was already seated in the 3rd pew from the front when he came in and took his customary place in the 5th pew on the opposite side of the aisle. She knew it was his customary place because Mrs. Caldwell had noted this detail along with several others, and Georgia had listened more carefully than was perhaps strictly necessary. She did not look at him during the service. She was very deliberate about this. Reverend Marsh gave a sermon about the virtue of patience that Georgia found timely in a way she suspected was not coincidental with her own situation, and she focused on the words, and the light coming through the small clear glass windows and the smell of pine wood and candle wax. After the service, when people moved outside into the bright morning air for the social hour that was as much a tradition as the sermon itself, Georgia found herself standing near the lemonade table talking to Mrs. Adler, the school board chairman's wife, about the merits of the McGuffey readers versus other available primer texts. It was a genuine conversation about something she genuinely cared about, and she was engaged in it, and she was not watching the crowd for a specific tall figure in a worn canvas duster. She was simply aware that he was there, 30 feet away, talking to a rancher she recognized as Mr. Beaumont, and then 20 feet away, accepting lemonade from the table, and then directly behind her, close enough that, when she turned to reach for her own glass, she nearly collided with him for the 2nd time in 4 days. "We have to stop meeting like this," she said, before she could stop herself, and then was immediately horrified, because that was the kind of thing you said to a person you were flirting with, and she was absolutely not flirting. He looked startled, which she found oddly satisfying, because he had until this moment given the impression of a man who was not frequently startled. And then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a slight relaxing of the set of his mouth, and she realized he was almost smiling. "I apologize," he said. "You seem to be in my path frequently." "Or you seem to be in mine," she said. "I suppose that depends on the direction of travel," he said. Mrs. Adler, who had been listening with considerable interest while pretending not to, excused herself to refill her glass on the other side of the table, which was not quite far enough away to be out of earshot, but was far enough to be technically absent. Georgia and Clayton stood by the lemonade table in the West Texas sunshine, and the conversation that followed was about nothing in particular: the progress of the spring cattle season, the reliability of the new freight service from San Antonio, the school board's plans for the fall, and it lasted perhaps 12 minutes, and Georgia walked home from church with something inside her chest that was lighter than anything she had felt in 4 years, possibly longer. She sat down at her small writing desk and wrote a careful letter to her cousin Louise in Memphis, who was the one person she maintained correspondence with from her previous life. She described Redemption with its wide, dusty street and its handful of solid buildings and its people who were mostly decent and trying hard. She did not describe Clayton Hawkins. She described the teaching position and the seamstress work and the fact that she was making her own way, which was true and important, and also, she recognized, incomplete. She sealed the letter and set it aside and picked up her needlework, the mending for Mrs. Beaumont that would pay her rent for 2 more weeks, and she worked by the late afternoon light and tried not to think about the fact that she had noticed he took his coffee without sugar, and that this was precisely the kind of detail that a woman who had decided not to fall in love should not be accumulating. The dark past arrived, as dark pasts tend to do, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday. Georgia was at the dressmaking table she had set up near the window of her room, working on a commission for Miss Clara Webb, who was the daughter of the bank manager, and who had strong opinions about sleeve width, when she heard the knock at her door. She expected Mrs. Caldwell about the laundry schedule. She opened the door to Thomas Redmond. He looked exactly the same and entirely different simultaneously. The charm that had been the first thing she ever noticed about him was still there, polished and ready, like a coin that has been handled so much it catches light automatically. But there were lines around his eyes now that had not been there before, and something behind them that was harder than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply learned to see it. "Georgia," he said, in the voice he used when he wanted her to feel warm about him, the voice that had worked on her once for years. She did not feel warm. She felt the cold she had come to associate with his presence, the particular chill of someone who has been betrayed, discovering that the source of betrayal is standing on their threshold. "How did you find me?" she said. She did not stand back to let him in. "Louise," he said, and the name landed like a stone in still water. Georgia felt something shift in her understanding of several things simultaneously. Her cousin Louise, who she had written to, who apparently had not kept Georgia's confidence. She filed that information away to deal with later and kept her face composed. "What do you want, Thomas?" she said. "To talk," he said. "To explain some things, too." "We are legally separated," she said. "My solicitor filed the papers in March. You received them." "I received them," he agreed. "Georgia, can we please—" "No," she said, very simply and with absolute finality, and she closed the door. She stood on her side of the closed door for approximately 90 seconds, breathing carefully, and then she went back to the sleeve width problem and Miss Clara Webb's commission, and she worked until the light failed, because work was what she had now, and she was not going to let Thomas Redmond reach through a door she had already closed and touch any part of the life she was building. But he did not leave Redemption. He had taken a room at the hotel on the north end of Main Street, and she began seeing him periodically in the places a small town required her to be, outside the post office, near Hargrove's, once on the far end of the boardwalk in front of the saloon. He did not approach her again after the closed door, but his presence was a kind of pressure that she felt constantly, a weight on the air, a reminder that the past she had escaped was currently sleeping 40 feet away from her daily path. She thought about telling someone. The difficulty was that Thomas had not done anything. He had knocked on her door and spoken her name, and she had closed the door, and he had respected that closing. In a town where she was still relatively new, still building reputation and trust, accusing a man of nothing specific seemed unwise. She was the woman with the uncertain history, the woman from somewhere else, the woman who had come west alone. She could not afford to appear unstable or dramatic. She said nothing. She watched from the corners of her eyes, and she kept her movements careful and her head high. And she tried to figure out what Thomas Redmond's actual purpose was, because Thomas Redmond always had a purpose, and it was never the one he announced. She found out on a Thursday evening when she was leaving the Adler's house, where she had been dining and discussing the curriculum for the fall school term with Mr. Adler and 2 other members of the school board. She was walking home in the blue-gray dusk, the air carrying that particular West Texas scent of dust and sage and the distant smell of cattle, and she heard her name. Thomas was standing at the edge of the boardwalk outside the barber shop. He was not alone. There was a man with him she did not recognize, heavy-set and wearing the clothing of someone who spent time outdoors in a professional capacity, though not a cowhand. A bounty hunter's clothes, perhaps, though she had no particular reason to think so. He was looking at Georgia with the flat, appraising look of a man who is considering a transaction. "I need to speak with you," Thomas said. He sounded different now, the charm stripped back, something beneath it showing. "Privately." "We have nothing to say privately," Georgia said. "You have a debt," he said, "from Memphis, money you took when you left." The cold settled over her like a second skin. "I took nothing that was not mine," she said. "I kept the household accounts. Every penny I saved came from my own management of money you gave me for household expenses." "There's a different interpretation," he said, "and I have a lawyer who's prepared to offer it, in court if necessary." The man beside him was still watching her with that flat transactional gaze, and Georgia understood now what he was. Not a bounty hunter, a process server or someone in that employ. Thomas had come here not to reconcile and not to talk. He had come here to threaten, which was what he had always done when the charm ran out. He found the thing that frightened you, and he stood it in front of you so you could see it clearly. What he did not know, and what he could not have known because he was a man who underestimated women as a matter of habit, was that the thing he was standing in front of her now was not, actually, the thing she was most afraid of. She was afraid of losing the teaching position. She was afraid of being driven out of redemption before she had properly arrived. But underneath those fears was a bedrock that Thomas had built with his own hands 4 years ago, a certainty that nothing he could do to her was as bad as what he had already done, and that she had survived that and built something from the pieces, and she was standing here in the West Texas dusk with her head up and her hands steady, and he did not have the power he thought he had. "Then I'll speak to my own lawyer," she said. "Good evening, Thomas." She walked home at a steady pace, and she did not look back. And she spent that evening at her writing desk not writing letters, but making a list of every financial transaction she had documented from the household accounts in Memphis, the records she had kept out of the habit of careful management, and which she had brought with her in the bottom of her carpet bag, along with her father's Bible and her mother's silver thimble. Because she had understood even then that documentation was a kind of protection. The records were solid. She was not worried about the legal threat in absolute terms. What she was worried about was the noise it could make, the disruption, the whispered speculation in a town that was still making up its mind about her. She did not sleep well again. The next morning she went to Hargrove's for thread and found Clayton Hawkins there, which was not unusual, and she noticed that he noticed the shadows under her eyes, which was more precise than she was comfortable with. She bought her thread and moved toward the door, and he fell into step beside her with the naturalness of a man who has known someone long enough to do that, which was strange because they had not actually known each other very long at all. "Something's troubling you," he said. It was not a question. She wanted to say something deflecting and pleasant and conclusory. Instead she said, "A complication from my previous life has arrived in redemption." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband," he said. She stopped walking, turned to look at him. "Who told you?" "Mrs. Caldwell mentioned you came from Memphis," he said, "and that your name before was different." She wasn't gossiping. She was explaining the region you came from in the context of a conversation about the quality of Eastern seamstresses versus Western ones. The ghost of that almost smile appeared. "Redemption is a small town." "He's threatening legal action," Georgia said, because apparently she had decided to tell him. "He's claiming I took money when I left, which is false. I have documentation, but he wants to cause disruption." Clayton was quiet again. In another man, this silence would have felt like discomfort, like the fumbling for a response. In him it felt like thinking, like the actual processing of information before speaking, which was a quality she had rarely encountered and valued highly. "Do you have a lawyer?" He said. "Not in redemption," she said. "I'll need to find one." "Amos Carey," he said. "He's in San Antonio, but he takes cases in this county." "I'll write you a letter of introduction if you want it. He's the best in this part of Texas." "Why would you do that?" she said, and there was less sharpness in it this time, more genuine puzzlement. "You barely know me." He looked at her, and the storm-colored eyes held hers with a steadiness that felt like ground under uncertain feet. "I know enough," he said, "and I don't like men who use legal threats to frighten women who left them for good reason." Something moved in her chest that was not the ember she had noticed before, but something newer, deeper, with roots she was not prepared to examine in the middle of Main Street on a Friday morning. She thought about the hidden motive behind his kindness because she had learned from Thomas Redmond to always consider the hidden motive, and she looked at Clayton Hawkins and could not find one. She looked carefully with the eyes of a woman who had been deceived by an expert, and there was simply nothing there that looked like deception. "I would appreciate the letter of introduction," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins." "Clayton," he said. The word surprised her. "Pardon." "My name," he said. "It's Clayton." "If you're going to accept my help, you might as well use it." "Georgia," she said after a moment. And something about the exchange felt like a door opening rather than closing, which was entirely counter to the plan she had made on the wagon heading west. But the plan, she was beginning to acknowledge, had been made by a woman who had not yet met Clayton Hawkins, and could therefore be forgiven for its incompleteness. He wrote her the letter of introduction that afternoon, sent it over to Mrs. Caldwell's with a boy from the livery. She wrote to Amos Carey in San Antonio that evening. 2 weeks later, Carey's response confirmed what she already knew. Thomas had no viable legal claim. The separation papers were valid. Her management of the household funds was documented and defensible, and her savings, properly speaking, had been her own. Carey offered to send Thomas Redmond a letter to this effect, using language that would make the cost of pursuing the matter clear. Thomas left redemption 3 days after Carey's letter arrived, and Georgia watched from the window of her room as the northbound stage carried him away, and she felt the weight lift from her shoulders so comprehensively that she had to sit down on the edge of her cot for a moment and breathe. She went to Hargrove's and paid Clayton Hawkins back every cent she owed him, counting it out carefully on the counter with Hargrove watching and her chin up and her hands entirely steady. Hargrove noted it in his ledger without comment, and Georgia walked out into the bright afternoon feeling cleaner than she had in months. She was halfway down the boardwalk when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Clayton there, coming from the direction of the livery. He had clearly been in the saddle recently, his boots carrying the dust of a long ride, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has been alone with his thoughts for several hours. "Thomas Redmond left this morning," she said. "I heard," he said. "I paid your account at Hargrove's," she said. "In full." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't have to do it so quickly." I told you I don't carry debt easily, she said. I meant it. She paused. I also owe you a different kind of debt for the introduction to Mr. Carey. I don't know how to repay that one. It doesn't need repaying, he said. Everything needs repaying, she said, one way or another. He studied her for a moment. Have dinner with me, he said, on Saturday, Mrs. Abernathy's dining room, not as a repayment of anything. Just as two people who have had a few awkward encounters and might benefit from a deliberate one. She looked at him. The afternoon light was falling at an angle that caught the planes of his face and the silver that was beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples, and she thought about Thomas Redmond and the promises she had made to herself on the wagon heading west, and she thought about the ember that had been burning quietly in her chest since the first morning in Hargroves, and she made a decision. All right, she said, Saturday, Mrs. Abernathy's dining room was the closest thing Redemption had to a fine restaurant, which meant it was a room with 6 tables covered in actual cloths, and an oil lamp on each table, and a menu that included roast beef on Saturdays if you arrived before 6 o'clock. Georgia wore her second dress, the blue one with the white collar, which was better than her everyday dress without being so formal as to suggest she was trying too hard, and she arrived at exactly the agreed time because she had been raised to believe that being precisely on time was both respectful and appropriate. Clayton was already there, which was not a surprise. He had changed his shirt, she noticed, and he had made another attempt at his hair, and there was something in the way he stood up when she came in, unhurried but immediately, that spoke of manners that were instinctive rather than performed. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, and there was a moment at the beginning where neither of them spoke, and it could have been awkward, and instead it was simply quiet, the way the land at dusk is quiet, full rather than empty. He told her about the ranch. He had started with 60 acres and 24 head, and had spent 4 years building it to something real, something that could last, not through luck but through the kind of relentless labor that does not ask whether it is convenient. He spoke about it not with boasting, but with the focused attention of a man who finds his work genuinely interesting. And Georgia found that she was genuinely interested in return, asking questions that led to longer answers, following the conversation down its branches. She told him about Memphis in a more general way, about her father who had believed in education, about growing up in a city that was still healing from the war, and what it meant to rebuild something on contested ground. She did not talk about Thomas Redmond. They both seemed to understand by some unspoken agreement that tonight was not about the dark past, but about the present, about the two people sitting at this table in the lamplight. She found out that he had indeed been a lawman, a deputy sheriff up in Abilene, Kansas, for 2 years in the early 1870s, when the cattle drives were making that town a place that needed considerably more law than it typically had. He had left when the cattle trade shifted and Abilene quieted, and he had come south and found the land outside Redemption, and decided it was the right shape for what he wanted to build. She asked him about the war, and he said he had been 12 years old when it ended, which made him 30 in 1878, and settled the question of his age that she had been estimating with some uncertainty. The roast beef arrived, and they ate and talked about books, which she had not expected, though she was not sure why, since she had no particular reason to think a Texas rancher would not have read anything. He had a preference for history and what he called useful fiction, meaning stories about people doing things, navigating the world in some active way. She told him she could not make that distinction, that all good fiction was useful in one direction or another, and he said he was open to being persuaded, and there was a quality in the exchange that felt like playfulness, like something that had been under the surface for several weeks deciding to come up for air. They walked out of Mrs. Abernathy's into the cool May evening, and the stars over West Texas were doing the thing they did in that part of the world, being so numerous and so low that walking under them felt like walking through something rather than simply beneath it. Georgia stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and looked up for a moment, not for effect but because it was impossible not to. "They're different here than in Memphis," she said. "Closer, or else the air is cleaner. I'm not sure which. Both, probably, he said. He was standing beside her, not too close, maintaining the appropriate distance of a man who understands that closeness is something you arrive at rather than something you announce. But she was aware of his presence beside her with a completeness that was difficult to dismiss. I'm glad I came here, she said. It was a simple statement, but it carried more weight than the words alone, and she thought he heard the weight. I'm glad you came here too, he said. And then he looked at her in the starlight, and whatever he might have said next remained unsaid, because this was only the first deliberate meeting and both of them seemed to understand that some things needed time. He walked her to Mrs. Caldwell's door, and she thanked him for the evening, and she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her cot, and smiled at nothing in particular for quite a long time before she put the lamp out. The teaching position was formally offered to Georgia on the 1st of June, beginning September 1st. She accepted it with a composure that lasted all the way home, and then collapsed into something considerably more uncontrolled. A brief and private joy that she allowed herself in the privacy of her room, sitting on her cot with her hands over her mouth and her eyes bright. She told Clayton that Sunday after church, because by then it had become natural to seek him out after the service for the conversation that had become its own kind of weekly ritual. Standing in the sunshine outside the church with lemonade, they mostly did not drink while they talked about whatever was immediate and interesting. He looked at her when she told him about the position, and the almost smile became something fuller, something that was not quite a grin but was in the same neighborhood, and he said, "Redemption doesn't know what it's gotten yet," and she laughed, which was another thing she was doing more of lately. They began to spend time together in ways that were not accidental. He would ride into town on Wednesdays, and on those days he would stop by the dressmaking table she had set up in the front parlor of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, where she received clients and did her work, and they would talk for half an hour or an hour before he continued with his errands. Sometimes they walked in the evenings along the road east of town, where the hills began, in the long summer light that held the landscape in gold and amber for an hour before dark. He was easy to be with in a way that continued to surprise her, not because she had expected him to be difficult, but because she had forgotten that being with someone could feel like rest rather than effort. She learned that he had a small library at the ranch, collected over years from wherever books could be found, and that he had a horse named Pemberton who was exceptionally intelligent, and had once opened a gate that Clayton was fairly certain required human hands to operate. She learned that he could cook, practically if not elaborately, and that he had opinions about the proper preparation of coffee that were somewhat strong and entirely correct. She learned that he listened, not the performative listening that Thomas had occasionally deployed, but the actual kind, where he held what you said and thought about it before responding. He learned, she supposed, the equivalent about her. She was not performing ease either. She was discovering, slowly and with some wonder, that the caution she had wrapped around herself like armor since Memphis was not disappearing exactly, but was becoming less necessary, the way a heavy coat becomes less necessary as a season turns. One evening in late July, walking back from the hills in the long golden light, she told him about Thomas Redmond. Not the surface facts, which he already knew in outline, but the actual shape of it, the layered deceptions, the inheritance, the way the marriage had been a series of rooms she had not been permitted to enter until they were already locked behind her. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it or diminishing it, because it was simply the truth about something that had happened to her, and it was part of who she was. And if this thing between them was going to be what she thought it might be becoming, then he needed to know it. He listened without interrupting, and without the expression she had seen on other faces when women described difficult marriages, that particular look of discomfort that men sometimes wore when they did not want to be made to understand something hard. He simply listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. They had stopped walking without deciding to, standing at the edge of the road where the grass bent away from the wind. "You trusted someone who didn't deserve it," he said finally. "That's not a failing. It's evidence of a capacity that someone else exploited. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. "You make it sound very simple." "It's not simple," he said. "But I think you've spent a long time confusing the scar with the wound. The wound was done to you. The scar is just the proof that you healed." She felt something give way inside her, not dramatically, not with the rupture of something breaking, but with the quiet release of something that had been held too long. She looked at the hills and the gold light and the endless West Texas sky, and she said, "I'm not entirely healed." "Neither am I," he said, and there was an honesty in it that invited her to ask. She asked. He had been engaged once in Kansas. A woman named Eliza, who had been the kind of woman who could make any room she walked into feel warmer, who had a laugh that he had been able to hear from across a street, who had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1873, in 3 days that had no right to be so short. He had stayed in Abilene for another year after that, going through the motions of the life he had planned, and then he had understood that he was not living in Abilene, he was enduring it, and he had packed everything and ridden south. He said it carefully, not as a wound he was displaying, but as a fact of his history that she should have. Georgia understood this. She understood the difference between sharing a dark past and weaponizing it, and he was doing the former with a precision that she could only admire. "Eliza," she said. "I don't talk about her often," he said, "but I didn't want you to not know." She nodded. The sky was going from gold to amber to the deep blue that preceded dark, and neither of them moved to return to town yet. "We're a pair," she said after a while, and there was something wry in it. "We are," he agreed, and there was something warm in the way he said it, something that meant something beyond the agreement itself. He kissed her for the first time on the 3rd of August, standing at the door of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house in the evening after a supper they had taken together at Mrs. Abernathy's. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was the natural conclusion of a series of small movements that had been building for weeks, a turn toward each other, a pause, a question in his eyes that she answered by not stepping back. It was brief and careful and honest, and when it ended she looked at him with her heart making a great deal of noise inside her chest and said, "I wasn't planning this." "Neither was I," he said. "Not when I paid for your groceries anyway." She laughed, surprised, and the laughter broke something open in the evening air between them, something easy and bright, and she said, "Was that when you started planning it?" "Somewhere around the second time we nearly walked into each other," he said. She went inside smiling, and Mrs. Caldwell, who had been sitting at the kitchen table and who missed nothing, looked at Georgia's face and said, with great satisfaction, "I see." Georgia did not correct her. The ranch, when she first saw it, was different from what she had imagined. She had pictured something rougher, more provisional, the kind of place that a man living alone and working hard would inhabit without much attention to anything beyond function. What she found, 12 miles east of Redemption in the shallow valley, where Clayton had built his life, was a house that was solid and well constructed with a covered porch along the front and window boxes that had been empty long enough to accumulate dust, but were clearly window boxes, meaning at some point he had intended to have flowers in them. Inside there were books on shelves he had built himself, and a kitchen with more organization to it than she had expected, and a bedroom that was simple and clean, and a front room with a fireplace and 2 good chairs and enough space to breathe. It was not luxurious. It was not trying to be. It was a house built by someone who knew the difference between what was necessary and what was merely habitual, and who had stripped away the latter without stripping away comfort. She had come to see about the school supplies, or that was the stated purpose. There was a collection of reference books he had mentioned that might be useful for the classroom, and he had offered them on loan for the fall term. This was a true purpose. It was not the only one, and they both knew it. She stood in the front room with a copy of Bancroft's History of the United States in her hands and looked at the window boxes visible through the glass and said, "Those need planting." He looked at them from across the room. I know, he said. I keep meaning to, there's always something else. Yarrow would do well in this soil, she said, or Indian paintbrush, something native. Do you know about plants, he said, with the quality of a man learning a new thing about someone he thought he knew. My mother kept a garden, she said. She knew every plant in it by its Latin name and its story. She said a garden was a conversation with the land. She paused. I'd like to start something here if you'd be willing, if I'm going to be here. The last sentence had slipped out with more intention than she had planned, and they both heard it. He set down the book he had been holding and looked at her, and the afternoon light through the window was doing the thing it did to everything in this part of Texas, making it more emphatic, more definite, the shadows darker and the bright things brighter. Are you telling me something? He said. I think I might be, she said. Yes. He crossed the room in the unhurried way he did everything, and he stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, and he said, I would very much like you to be here, permanently. She set the Bancroft carefully on the nearest shelf. That would require a certain formality, she said. I know, he said. Given my recent history with certain formalities, she said, I need you to understand that I would be coming into it with a great deal more caution than most women my age. That's only reasonable, he said. I would need to know that you are who you appear to be, she said. Not because I doubt it, because I've learned that the cost of assuming it is too high. I know, he said. Ask me anything. She looked at him for a long time in the afternoon light. The man who had paid her bill quietly and walked her home, and listened to her past, and told her his own, and planted nothing in the window boxes, because there was always something else, and now here she was suggesting she might be the something else. She looked at him and she thought about Thomas Redmond and the trap that love could be when the wrong person built it, and she looked at Clayton Hawkins, and she thought about the past 4 months of small encounters and growing trust and the slow, careful, unrepeatable construction of something genuine. I'll plant the window boxes this spring, she said. He understood her. He nodded slowly, with the serious attention he gave to things that mattered. Then I'll ask you properly before winter, he said. He did. He asked her on the last day of October, which was bright and cold and impossibly clear, the kind of day the West Texas sky produced occasionally as if to remind the people living under it of the terms of the arrangement. He had come into town on the pretense of supplies and had asked if she wanted to walk, and they had walked out past the edge of town to the place where the road curved up toward the hills, and he had stopped and turned to her with his hat in his hands and the afternoon light on his face, and he had asked her. He told her he was not a man given to speeches. He told her he had spent 7 years since Eliza being very certain that the part of him that was suited to this kind of asking was permanently unavailable, and that she had changed his mind on that with no particular effort or strategy, simply by being herself, a quality he admired and would not ask her to modify. He told her he could offer her the ranch and his labor and his honest company for whatever years he had, and that he would spend those years trying to be equal to the trust she had been cautious about extending, and that he understood if she was not yet ready, but that he wanted her to know he was asking. Georgia looked at the hills and the cold blue sky and the man in front of her with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady and honest, and she thought about all the things love had meant to her before and all the ways it had been used to obscure something else, a trap, a hidden motive, a transaction pretending to be a gift. She thought about what love looked like when it was none of those things, when it was simply two people standing in honest ground. Yes, she said, I'll marry you, Clayton Hawkins. He put his hat back on his head and he took her hands and held them, and the cold October wind went past them both, and neither of them moved away from it. They were married on the 22nd of November, 1878, in the Redemption Church where they had been standing near the lemonade table all summer, by Reverend Marsh, who seemed genuinely pleased in the way that men of religion are pleased when the work of grace becomes visible in front of them. The church was full. because Redemption was the kind of town that took its communal celebrations seriously, and Georgia had acquired more community than she had recognized until she stood at the front of the church and saw them all. Mrs. Caldwell with her sharp eyes bright, Mr. and Mrs. Adler in the third pew, the families whose children she was already teaching, the women whose dresses she had sewn, Hargrove from behind his counter, and a great many people whose names she now knew and who now knew hers. She wore ivory silk that she had made herself, not the Henderson dress, which she had eventually sold to a woman in San Antonio through a letter she had sent on Mrs. Hobbs's recommendation, but new silk that she had saved for and cut and sewn herself, with the same fine embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She looked at her own work, and she thought that this dress made with her own hands for her own marriage to a man she trusted, was as far from Thomas Redmond as distance could make it. Clayton stood at the front of the church in his good coat with his hair more thoroughly subdued than she had ever managed to observe it, looking at her as she came down the aisle with an expression that was not performance, that was simply the unguarded face of a man receiving something he had not entirely believed he deserved. She walked toward him and thought, "This is what it looks like when it is real." Reverend Marsh said the words and they said them back, and Clayton put a ring on her finger, a simple band of gold that had been her mother's, which he had somehow known to acquire from Mrs. Caldwell, who had written to George's cousin Louise on his behalf. And this gesture, this private thoughtfulness, this hidden research done to give her something irreplaceable, was the thing that made her breath catch in the church in front of all of Redemption. She had told him about her mother. He had listened. He had remembered. That was love, she thought. That specific kind of attention. That was what it actually was. They went to the ranch that evening, and the house that had been his was now theirs, and she stood in the front room where she had first seen the empty window boxes, and she felt the particular completeness of a person arriving somewhere after a very long journey. The first winter was hard the way first winters in new arrangements are always hard, not between them. Their ease with each other held and deepened through the cold months, but in the practical sense. There was a late-season snowfall in December that was unusual for West Texas and kept cattle in the lower pastures for 3 weeks and required constant work from Clayton and the 2 ranch hands, Jake and Samuel, who had been with him for 2 years and who treated Georgia with a quiet respect that she appreciated. The wood supply needed constant replenishing. The schoolhouse roof developed a leak in February that she addressed by writing a detailed and persuasive letter to the school board that resulted in the repair being completed in less than 2 weeks. She taught 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and she loved the work with a fierceness that surprised her, though perhaps it should not have. She had always been someone who found meaning in the transmission of knowledge, in the moment when a concept settled into a child's face like a key turning, when you could see the understanding arrive. She was strict about attendance and gentle about difficulty, and completely uncompromising about the importance of reading, which she considered the foundational skill from which all others grew. In the evenings she came home to the ranch, and she planted herself in the front room with Clayton, sometimes talking and sometimes reading in a companionable quiet that she had not known she was starving for, the deep peace of being with someone who did not require performance, who wanted you precisely as you were. She planted the window boxes in April. She put in yarrow and Indian paintbrush and a border of sage that smelled like the landscape made domestic. And Clayton came out onto the porch and watched her with his coffee and said nothing because no words were needed. And she understood that this was also love, this comfortable silence that contained everything. She wrote to Louise in the spring, a long letter that covered the marriage and the ranch and the teaching and the winter, and she included in it a clear and honest account of the fact that Thomas Redmond's arrival in Redemption had been partly Louise's fault. And she said that she was not holding it against her, but that she wanted it acknowledged, because the ability to name a wrong thing was something she had learned to insist on. Louise wrote back at length, apologizing with what sounded like genuine remorse, explaining that Thomas had been persuasive and that she had not understood the nature of the threat. And Georgia read the letter and forgave her cousin, because forgiveness was something she had decided to practice rather than withhold, not for other people's benefit but for her own. The news that she was carrying a child came to her in June of 1879, confirmed by Dr. Peters, who had his office above the hardware store and who was thorough and competent, and told Georgia plainly what she could expect over the coming months. She told Clayton that evening on the porch, where they had established the habit of sitting together after supper in the long summer evenings when the work was done and the land went quiet. She told him simply, without preamble, and watched his face. She had not been certain what she would see. She knew he wanted a family. They had talked about it in the way they talked about most things, honestly and with attention to what each of them actually felt. But knowing a thing in the abstract and watching it arrive in reality were different, and she had waited for the reality. What she saw was something that moved through him the way a wave moves through deep water, profound and from some internal source, and he reached for her hand and held it, and then turned to look at the hills in the evening light for a long moment. And when he turned back there was something on his face that she had not seen before, something that was beyond even what she had learned to recognize as his fullest expressions, deeper and newer. "A child," he said, as if testing the reality of the word. "A child," she confirmed. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating, steady and strong. And she thought about the woman she had been in the general store in May of 1878, counting coins she did not have enough of, and the complete impossibility of knowing then that this was where she was going. Their son was born on the 14th of February, 1880, which was a detail that Reverend Marsh considered cosmically significant, and which Georgia found genuinely funny for years afterward. He came into the world at 4 in the morning with considerable noise and healthy lungs, delivered by Dr. Peters in the front bedroom of the ranch house, while Clayton paced the length of the porch outside with a focus that Mrs. Caldwell, who had come to help, described later as absolutely extraordinary in its intensity. They named him James Carroll Hawkins. James for no specific person, but because it was solid and real, and Carroll for Georgia's maiden name, for her father who had believed that daughters deserved education, and her mother who had known the Latin names of every plant in her garden, and who had died when Georgia was 15, and who was present here in some way that could not be named precisely, but was felt entirely. Clayton held his son for the first time with the carefulness of a man handling something irreplaceable, which was accurate, and James Carroll Hawkins looked up at his father with the unfocused intensity of a newborn who is taking a first account of the world, and Georgia, lying in the bed watching them, felt the particular alignment of a life that has arrived at its intended place. The ranch grew in the years that followed. Clayton added 20 acres in 1880 and improved the cattle operation with better breeding stock he sourced from a reputable operation north of San Antonio, and the enterprise became genuinely profitable, not wealthy but stable in the way that good land well managed can produce. He hired a third ranch hand, a young man named Francisco who had worked cattle all his life and who taught James, when James was old enough to be interested, how to rope with a proficiency that Clayton himself admitted was superior to his own. Georgia continued teaching. The school board renewed her contract every year without difficulty, and she built the curriculum with care and ambition, adding subjects as the children were ready and the available texts allowed. By 1882, the school had 41 students and Georgia had been joined by a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Agnes Pryor, who had come from Ohio with excellent training and a disposition that Georgia approved of immediately. They made a good pair, complementary in their methods, and the school became one of the things Redemption was proud of. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in the autumn of 1882, small and determined, and so obviously her father's child in the shape of her expressions, that the resemblance was a source of considerable comment. They named her Alina Rose, Alina for the novelist Mrs. George Eliot, whose work Georgia had been rereading during the pregnancy, and whose intelligence she wanted to honor in some small way. And Rose because Clayton had by this time developed his own investment in the window boxes and had added roses to the front porch in the spring. James was 2 years old when Alina was born and regarded her with the solemn attention of a child doing important assessment work, then apparently decided she was acceptable, and spent the following years acting as her appointed protector with a dedication that was both touching and occasionally excessive. Georgia and Clayton had a conversation one evening in the fall of 1883, sitting by the fire after the children were in bed, about everything that had happened and where it had gone and what they had built. It was not a formal inventory, not a deliberate occasion. It was simply two people in a warm room after a good day, following a thread of thought together. She said she had been thinking about the day in Hargrove's store, about the coins and the counter and the particular quality of the humiliation she had been about to absorb, and the way his voice had come from behind her and undone it without ceremony. She said she had been so angry and so grateful simultaneously that she had not known which one to lead with. He said he remembered it differently than she might expect. He said he had not been thinking about any grand gesture. He had been standing in the store and he had seen her at the counter, and he had understood the situation in an instant, the precise particular way she was holding her spine and the set of her jaw and the coins on the counter, and something in him had responded before he had a chance to reason about it, an instinct more fundamental than strategy. He had simply said the words and paid the amount and hoped she would not entirely hate him for it. She laughed. "You were worried I would hate you." "You seemed very capable of it," he said, and the almost smile was there, the one she knew now so well that she could see it even when it was barely present. "I almost did," she said. "For about 2 minutes, and then I started being very preoccupied with why I hadn't." They sat with the fire and the quiet of the sleeping house around them, and she thought about secrets and dark pasts and the forced choices and the ultimate sacrifices that life in the real world required of people who were trying to build something real. She thought about the trap that love could be, and the way this love had been nothing like a trap from the very beginning, had been instead the slow dismantling of the defenses she had built inside herself, one quiet gesture at a time. "I was so determined not to fall in love again," she said. "I had made up my mind thoroughly." "I know," he said. "I could see it. And yet here we are," she said. "Here we are," he said. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had held on the porch the evening she had told him about the baby, the hand that wore her mother's ring. "I'm glad you changed your mind." "I didn't change it exactly," she said. "You changed the evidence on which it was based." He considered this. "That might be the best thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they watched the fire for a while, two people who had both carried secrets and survived dark pasts and navigated forbidden feelings and found, against the considerable odds that life in the year 1878 in the American West presented, each other. The children were asleep in the back of the house. The window boxes would need replanting in the spring. The school board had already asked Georgia to chair the curriculum committee for the county, which would mean occasional travel to San Antonio, and Clayton had said he would manage without her on those days, which was true, and which she had told him was not the point. The point was that she wanted to go, and she also wanted to come home, and being able to want both was a form of freedom that she had not known she was missing until she had it. She fell asleep in the chair by the fire, and Clayton sat with her sleeping weight against him, and read the history book open on his knee, and listened to the West Texas wind working at the corner of the house, that particular sound that was not alarming but was honest, the sound of the land reminding you it was always there, always larger than anything you built on it, and that the correct response to this was not to stop building but to build honestly, with materials that could last. In the spring of 1884, Georgia got a letter from Amos Carey in San Antonio informing her that Thomas Redmond had died in January in a rooming house in Louisiana, of causes unspecified but consistent with the difficulties of a man who had lived the way Thomas had lived. Georgia read the letter twice, and then set it down on her dressmaking table, which she still kept up in the back room of the house, working on commissions on Saturday mornings for the pleasure of it more than the necessity. She felt things about Thomas Redmond's death that were not simple, because she had been honest enough with herself over the years to acknowledge that the relationship had not been only suffering, that there had been things she had loved about him before she understood who he fully was, and that a person's death was always a complete thing regardless of the history. She let herself feel those complicated things, and then she folded the letter and put it away and went out to where Clayton was working with Francisco at the fence line and told him. He received the information with the care he gave to everything she told him. He did not say anything falsely consoling. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I think I am." "Let me know if that changes," he said. "I will," she said, and she meant it, and she went back to the house and checked on James, who was in the garden attempting to construct something out of wood and rope that he refused to explain, and Alina, who was sitting on the porch with a picture book that she could not yet fully read but was managing with impressive confidence, narrating a story that may or may not have been related to the pictures. Georgia sat down beside Alina on the porch and listened to the story her daughter was telling, something involving a horse and a considerable disagreement about the proper use of a hat, and the West Texas afternoon spread out in front of them, enormous and golden and endlessly patient, and she thought, "I built this. From nothing, from coins that were not enough, from a past that tried its best to define me, I built this." She looked at the window boxes, full of yarrow and Indian paintbrush and the sage that smelled of the landscape, and the roses that Clayton had added and which had done remarkably well in the West Texas soil, climbing the porch post with a confidence that seemed entirely appropriate. She looked at the road east that she had walked down with Clayton so many times in the evening light, talking about everything and nothing, learning the full shape of each other in the way that time and honesty permit. She looked at the house that had been his and was now theirs, with the front room where the books lived on shelves he had built, and the kitchen where she made coffee the way he liked it, and he made biscuits the way she liked them, and neither of them kept score because that was not what this was. She looked at her daughter beside her on the porch, and at her son in the garden with his rope and his inexplicable project, and she felt the full weight of what she had, and she did not take any of it for granted, because she knew, with the precise knowledge of a woman who had lost things, exactly what it was worth. Clayton came back from the fence line in the late afternoon, dusty and ready for supper, and he came up the porch steps and he stopped for a moment when he saw her sitting there with Alina, and his face did the thing it did when he was looking at something he could not quite believe was his, that interior quality of grateful disbelief that he had mostly trained away but which appeared sometimes without announcement. She saw it. She always saw it. It was one of her favorite things about him, one of the small and private things that belonged to their specific and unrepeatable life. This man who had paid for her groceries one morning in a general store before she could count her last coins, who had done it quietly and without performance, who had meant nothing by it except that he could not stand to watch a capable woman be diminished by arithmetic, and who had accidentally in the process of that single quiet gesture set in motion the most important story of both their lives. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "I'll wash up," he said. He touched her shoulder as he went past, the brief and habitual touch of two people who have made a home of each other, and she felt it through the fabric of her dress with the same awareness she had felt everything from him, the same complete attention that had never, in 6 years, diminished. She got up and went inside to start supper, and Alina followed her with the picture book, and James came in from the garden with dirt on his hands and an explanation for the rope project that was detailed and largely incomprehensible. and the house filled with the ordinary noise of a family at the end of a day. And it was the most extraordinary thing Georgia Redmond Hawkins had ever known. Later, when the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean and the lamp was low, she sat at the table with her journal, which she had kept since Memphis and which had gone from a record of things endured to a record of things built, and she wrote about the day. She wrote about Carrie's letter and Thomas and the complicated feelings, and the way she had sat on the porch with Alina and the afternoon light. She wrote about Clayton coming up the porch steps and the look on his face, and she tried to find words for it that were adequate, which was always the project with the best things. She wrote, "I know now what it means to be known. Not performed at, not managed, not required to be a version of myself that fits a story someone else is telling. Known, seen in the full, complicated, honest shape of everything I am, and chosen on the basis of that seeing, not despite it." She wrote, "The coins on the counter, the quiet voice from behind me, the debt I did not want and the help I could not refuse and the pride that almost made me walk away from the best thing that was ever offered to me." She wrote, "I used to believe that love was something that happened to you, outside your control, that the best you could do was survive it. I know now that love is also something you do. Something you practice and tend and return to every day, like a garden, like a school, like a ranch on good land in West Texas, like window boxes full of things that grow." She closed the journal and set her pen down and looked at the lamp for a moment, the steady flame behind the glass, the reliable light. Clayton came in from checking the cattle one last time, the evening round he made without fail regardless of weather, and he sat down across the table from her and poured himself a cup of the coffee that had cooled in the pot, and he looked at her with those storm-colored eyes that were not threatening at all once you knew them, that were simply the color of the sky when the weather was doing something honest. "Good day," he said. It was both a statement and a question. "A good day," she confirmed. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside the window, the West Texas stars were doing their thing, being numerous and low and patient, the same stars that had been there the night she had looked up after their first dinner at Mrs. Abernathy's and said they were closer here than in Memphis. "I'm going to write to the county board about the science materials," she said. "Miss Pryor has been teaching natural history from memory, which is admirable but insufficient. You'll get them to fund it," he said. "Of course I will," she said, and he almost smiled, and she felt the familiar warmth of it. They sat at the table in the lamplight for another hour, talking and sometimes not talking, two people who had found in each other not a rescue from the world, but a way of standing in it that was stronger than either of them had been alone. Outside, the land went on in all directions the way West Texas land does, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in its demanding way, and the house held them, and the lamp burned steady, and the window boxes waited for spring. There was a third child, a boy they named Thomas, not for the Thomas who had done harm but reclaiming the name for something different, something whole, born in the summer of 1885 when James was 5 and Alina was nearly 3. And he came into the ranch house life with the easy confidence of a youngest child who has arrived after the hard work of establishment is done, and has therefore always known the world to be a place of warmth and order. Georgia watched her 3 children grow in the West Texas landscape with the attention of someone who understood that growth was always in process, always requiring something, always becoming something beyond what you could predict. James became serious and capable, with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and he rode and roped and read with equal proficiency, and at 14 was already discussing the possibility of studying law someday, which Georgia encouraged with a thoroughness that made Clayton raise his eyebrows and smile. Alina became herself in the particular fierce way of middle children who must establish their own territory, and her territory turned out to be music, of all things, and she taught herself the guitar from a method book Georgia ordered from San Antonio, and she had a voice that stopped whatever was happening when she used it fully, clear and true, and carrying something old in it. And Thomas was simply Thomas, sunny and social, and interested in every living thing from insects to horses. The child who brought creatures home and asked questions that required Georgia to consult her reference books. The child who made friends with everyone in Redemption without effort. The town's child as much as theirs. Georgia taught at the Redemption School until 1889, when she stepped back from daily teaching to take a larger role in the county educational board, a position that allowed her to shape the curriculum and the standards for multiple schools across the region. She hired 2 additional teachers in her tenure and established a small lending library in Redemption that was the first of its kind in the county, funded partly by the school board and partly by a donation from Clayton Hawkins that was made without public announcement because that was how he did things. She found out about the library donation when she saw the accounts, because she kept the accounts, and she confronted him about it in the kitchen one evening with the ledger open on the table between them. "You donated to the library anonymously," she said. "Not anonymously," he said. "I told Adler where it came from. I just didn't want it announced at the board meeting." "Why not?" He shrugged. "It's your work," he said. "Not mine. I don't need credit for funding what you built." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man she had known for 11 years, and felt the same clear recognition she had felt in the lamplight the night he told her he remembered her mother's name. He was still the same man who had paid for her groceries quietly. Still operating by the same fundamental principle, that good done without spectacle was still good, that the measure of a thing was not the recognition it received but the effect it had in the world. "You are the most consistent person I have ever known," she said. "Is that a complaint?" he said. "It is emphatically not a complaint," she said. They had 23 more years together in that house on the land east of Redemption. The railroad came through in 1881 as Mrs. Hobbs had predicted, and the town grew, and the world grew around the world they had built, and they grew with it. There were difficulties, because there are always difficulties. A cattle fever that swept the county in 1886 and cost them a third of the herd. A drought in 1892 that required every kind of careful management they had. A winter so severe in 1895 that 3 families in the county were left destitute, and Georgia organized the relief effort with the same precise energy she brought to everything. They navigated all of it together. That was the fundamental fact of their life. They were together in it, facing the same direction, bringing different skills to the same project, which was the building and maintenance of a life that was good. Clayton's dark hair went fully silver in his 50s, and it suited him in the way that weathering suits good materials, making the original quality more visible rather than obscuring it. Georgia's hair went silver at the temples in her 40s, and she wore it with the equanimity of a woman who has more interesting things to think about, which she did always. James Hawkins did study law. He went to Austin and studied, and came back to the county, and eventually became a county judge, which was something Georgia held with a private and enormous pride that was entirely disproportionate to the composure with which she discussed it publicly. Alina married a man from San Antonio named David Reyes, a schoolteacher himself, which Georgia approved of immediately for reasons that were transparent to everyone. They had 4 children and visited Redemption every summer without fail. Thomas became a veterinarian, which surprised no one who had watched him growing up, and his practice served the county for decades. On an evening in October of 1901, Georgia and Clayton sat on the porch of the ranch house in the long autumn light that was different from spring light, more golden, with more weight to it, the light of a season arriving at its completion. The window boxes were still there. She had replanted them every spring for 23 years, and they had never been empty in the warm months. She was 49 and he was 53, and they had been married for 23 years, and they had built everything you see in front of them from coins on a counter and a quiet voice. "Do you remember Mr. Hargrove's face?" she said. "When I paid the account." He considered. He looked like a man being asked to add something to a ledger that he hadn't anticipated. "That's exactly right," she said. "That is precisely the face." "He recovered quickly," Clayton said. "He always did," she said. Hargrove had retired 2 years ago and handed the store to his son, who ran it with the same thoroughness if somewhat less personality. The hills to the east were going amber in the failing light, the same hills she had walked toward and away from in 100 different weathers and seasons, the hills that had been backdrop to more conversations than she could count, more of the construction of this life than could be fully tracked. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the fact that when you walked into that store and paid my bill, you didn't know anything about me. Not really. You could see the situation, but you didn't know if I was worthy of the gesture. You didn't know who I was." He was quiet for a moment, watching the hills. "That's true," he said. "Why did you do it then?" she said. "Not the explanation you gave Hargrove, the credit, the it can be repaid. The real reason." He thought about this with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "Because you were trying very hard," he said finally. "I could see you trying very hard to make an impossible situation work with dignity. And it seemed to me that if someone could make that a little less impossible without calling attention to the making, they should." She looked at him in the autumn light, the silver-haired man on the porch of the house they had made together, the man who had been Eliza's and then no one's and then hers, who had built a life with his hands and his patience and his quality of attention, who had never in 23 years of marriage stopped paying her that quality of attention. "That is the most you've ever said about that day," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 23 years, he said. I had time to develop my answer. She laughed, and the laugh went out across the evening air toward the hills, and he turned to look at her with that expression she had loved since before she was willing to admit she loved anything, that quality of interior light. "I love you, Clayton Hawkins," she said. She said it regularly, had been saying it for years, but she said it each time meaning it fully because she had learned early and completely the lesson about not assuming the things you most needed to say had already been heard. "I love you, Georgia Hawkins," he said, and he meant it the same way, with the full weight of everything that name contained. The woman who had walked into Hargrove's general store with coins that were not enough and pride that was more than sufficient, and who had come into his life and filled every empty window box and built every impossible thing and been, in the most complete and irreplaceable sense, the whole shape of what home was. The light went on falling over the hills and the land, that ancient West Texas light that had been doing this since long before either of them had come here and would be doing it long after, and they sat together on the porch in the middle of it, and everything was accounted for, and everything was whole.